I would like to introduce and welcome our speaker today. It is our own Mark Linsky, who teaches in political science and history. And he has a very interesting history himself of writing feature articles and being the recipient of the Weinberger History Award for a paper on punishment of sex offenders, and today he's going to talk about, the title of the paper is Rage and Rebellion, an investigation into the Creole incident and factors which determine successful and unsuccessful slave revolts in American history.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. First, for both faculty as well as students, may I ask how many students are here today? Please feel free to raise your hand. Very good. Welcome to all of you. Is there anybody in my class, my History 109 class here? Okay, I'll get hold of them on Monday and punish them. If I could ask you, please, if you could just hand out one or more, anybody in the faculty who would like more than one, feel free to take it. It's basically a very, very short little bibliography of work and material which I think would be valuable to you if you want to pursue this topic any further, number one. Number two, it's a pleasure to be here before such an august audience in February, which from my perspective is better than the other way around. And before I get going, I have to tell you how I came here. It's an embarrassing story, and I have to tell the story. It's embarrassing for me. But I have to tell you that when I heard that the spring was open and I had an opportunity to give this presentation, I called Nina, we spoke. I said, Nina, I am so excited. I want to give an address on a topic which is going to knock people's socks off. Nina, I want my address to be on that mid-Victorian 19th century reprobate, that 19th century rake and bounder, a man whose sexual escapades were understood and known not just through Britain but on 3 continents, a man who was as comfortable, seducing a duchess at her home in Wessex as he was having his way with a scullery maid in the basement of a London townhome. I said, Nina, no, I want to do this. I want to give this address on Sir William Bumslapper. And Nina said to me, Mark, you have completely misunderstood what this is all about. The title of this is Occasional Lectures, not a series on lectures. So I said to Nina at that point, I said, Nina, you've taken all the wind out of my sails. And then I said, Nina, wait, wind out of my sails. Sailing ships. February, Black History Month. Slaves, sailing ships. Nina, I've got it. We're going to do it on the slave ship Creole. Is there anyone here who's at all familiar with what happened on the slave ship Creole in the fall of 1841? Good, neither am I. No, cheesy, of course. What we're going to be looking at today is probably one of the most unique, one of the most exciting, one of the most dramatic events in the history of American slavery. And I hope you find it as intriguing as I have in doing a series of research projects over an extended period of time. I will do that, and then at the last few minutes I want to save for a topic which is definitely joined to the primary topic, and I'll be reading about a page and a half of a kind of a skeleton of an abstract for a paper that I'm working on currently, which may form a matrix for discussion about the topic itself. Let's start at the beginning. You notice that I brought in a map. And what I've done, you've noticed I cut off roughly 2/3 or more of the United States. And the reason I did this is let's do the background first. We're not talking about slavery, essentially, as a moral issue here. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to look at slavery for what it was for the people who were involved in the slave trade. It was a business. It was a business. And one of the things that is frequently overlooked in terms of the business of slavery is how did you move slaves to where they were most needed, and where were they most needed? And what we find in American history is that after the end of the War of 1812, with the Great Cotton South being open, we have a migration of slaves, a forced migration, which takes the brunt of American slaves all the way from what we might call the area of the Upper South, the Gentile South, the Chesapeake Bay South, and moves them by one form or another into the deep cotton and sugar South, which is to say the open lands of places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. So the question arises, how did they actually get there? And the answer to that first is there were primarily 3 ways to get there: overland, freshwater, and saltwater. Obviously, we're going to be dealing with the saltwater route, but let me dispose of them fairly quickly. The overland route there were really two primary routes, more than that, but you could either leave this area and kind of stay obviously south of the Ohio River. You wouldn't want to go north of there, would you? For obvious reasons. So you'd stay south of the Ohio River, follow the tracks down, probably head through Nashville, take what today is the Natchez Trace, which is a beautiful parkway today for anyone who has an opportunity to do it if you haven't done it. It's just stunning, from Nashville to Natchez. And that would end up here in Mississippi, which is just off the map, but that's all right. A second route would be to take the route south and then across, and obviously get your slaves gone this way. Now, these slaves were I suppose in our mind, were the traditional way in which slaves were transported. This was called the coffle, the slave coffle, spelled with a C. And the coffle was what we perceive of as men, women, and children going along these dusty tracks, presumably being watched, herded over by a number of individuals who were their overseers, until they reached the markets, first in Natchez and later on, obviously, in New Orleans. The length of time of travel of this was going to be somewhat flexible, but you could expect you're going to be on the road 6 or 8 weeks. It was a preferred method of travel, and the vast majority of slaves actually did reach their destination via the overland route, which is sort of interesting when you think about it. However, there was a second route, a freshwater route. And the freshwater route would have been to take these slaves from the Chesapeake Bay region, march them a shorter distance, which was going to be here to the Ohio River, and there embark them on riverboats. And the riverboats would go down the Ohio to the Mississippi, down the Mississippi, once again to be offloaded at one of the major terminuses for slaves, which was either going to be Natchez or it was going to be New Orleans. So that was the second method. Now, that method was very expensive, and so we find that to be the least used of all methods of transport. But there was a third method of transport, and that was what was known as the Coastwise trade route. The Coastwise trade route. And those were ships which embarked here in the Chesapeake region. It could be Baltimore, more likely it was going to be Richmond, or it was going to be one of the towns downriver from Richmond, or even in those days, Washington, D.C. And at that point, the ship then made its way down the Atlantic coast, around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, to make a landing at the Crescent City, New Orleans, where, of course, most of these individuals were going to be resold into bondage, and they would wind up either on the cotton plantation, or they would end up, even more dreadfully, on the sugar plantation. And that ultimately was a little bit like going to the gulag, because once you went to the sugar plantation, the odds were that you were not going to be coming back. Having said that, let's take a look. I put up a little map of, or a little diagram of the slave ship Creole. Notice that I labeled it proposed. There are no pictures of this particular ship in existence. And scholars seem to agree that we can only best guesstimate what this ship was actually all about. But it's important because it's instrumental to understanding what's going to happen aboard this ship. The Creole was a fairly new ship. She'd probably been built a year and a half before the events of the fall of 1841. She was pretty typical for her time. Notice that she displaced a lot less, you might say, than we would find if we went down to Harbor Island today and took a look at some of those mega yachts. They'd be a lot bigger than this ship. The ship here displaced about 160 tons, and we can extrapolate that it was probably around 100 feet in length from stem to stern. Probably that's so. We have no existent diagram of it, as I said, but notice that most historians seem to feel that she had 2 masts. Not 3, but 2 masts. So technically, I mean, she's a brig, but she carries 2 masts. The other thing that's interesting about her is that she has only one hold. And this is going to be critically important later on, because this one hold, such as it is ultimately going to be divided essentially by the placement of boxed tobacco, which is piled from the deck right on up to the ceiling of the hold area. And that is going to form 2 sub-holds, and in one of these we're going to find the women, and in the other hold we're going to find the men. So this ship was pretty typical. Let me just say a quick word about the type of voyage it was. When we think about the transport of slaves, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is we think about the horror of what happened on the famed Middle Passage. Because we know that during the great slave era, the transport of slaves from essentially West Africa over to the New World People were laid cheek to jowl. They were laid literally head to foot with only inches apart. They were unable to move. They were shackled. They lived in their own urine, their own excrement. They were fed only the minimal amount. They died like flies. A terrible, terrible situation. The transport of slaves, by the time we get to the era of the 1830s and the 1840s, I don't want you to have that image in your mind because it's not that. Now, I'm not saying it's a carnival cruise. I'm not going to say that either. It's not as if everyone was living in this enormous amount of comfort, because that wouldn't be true. But the fact of the matter is, as we will discover, that the conditions aboard a ship like this tended to be much more relaxed, much more humane. And in many ways, there was an expectation that, look, we're all into this thing together. We've got to go from point A to point B. Those who were the whites and the overseers who we'll be talking about were responsible for keeping order. It was understood that slaves were going to be fed at least decently. They were going to be kept relatively warm and dry aboard the ship, such as it was, et cetera, et cetera. You may ask yourself, why did this particular cruise take place in the fall of 1841? Well, the answer to that is fairly easy also. Remember, if a slave couple was moving overland, in those days, we're not talking highways. We're talking roads which essentially are dirt tracks and aren't even corduroy. Which means that when the rains come and the weather gets really cold, you don't want to be transporting, essentially, human goods, chattel, over those roads, because you encourage the possibility, obviously, of sickness and death, which doesn't do you any good at the selling end, and also throws your entire time schedule off. So what we find is that just as you and I would probably want to cruise, take that Carnival Cruise Line sometime in the late fall, the winter time, after hurricane season is over, the same time that the roads became more impassable, it became more practical to actually send these people via the Coastwise route over to New Orleans. So that's the reason that these ships were sailing at this particular time. Let me introduce you now to the players. I would like to start here with the slave owners. The first name I have on the board, this is Johnson and Epperson. This is a slave company. Now, these people being slavers, they make their living essentially buying, transporting, and selling slaves. And this is a good living for the big companies. And as a result of that, these guys were set up a little bit like ExxonMobil. In other words, you might call it slave vertical integration. They control the entire process. They housed them, they fed them, and ultimately they actually controlled many of the ships that transported these slaves from one place to another. So Johnson and Epperson happens to be the owner of the slave ship Creole. There's only one other player that's worth mentioning here, and he has the interesting name, and perhaps appropriately, of Thomas McCargo, no relationship to Clutch. Now, Thomas McCargo was a guy who, again, we know very little about in practical terms, but I've done some work and I've traced back, and it's very clear that this guy was operating as a slave dealer, and he was operating out of Virginia. Periodically, he shows up other places. I ran across a reference to him in a newspaper where he had actually rented a house in Natchez. He was housing his slaves there. He was obviously selling them on the block there. So these guys were on the road. They were either going to be, if they weren't real big, they were probably going to have associates who were going to work with them at one place or another. And as a result of that, McCargo tends to float between Virginia and the places in the Deep South. So Thomas McCargo is going to have his own slaves aboard this ship. The Johnson and Epperson firm is going to have the largest number. McCargo is going to have a substantial number, and he's going to have, and the number is flexible for some reason, but we're going to guesstimate that he probably has somewhere in the neighborhood of 29 or 30 slaves, according to what we know about this. We get to the fall of 1841. This ship is getting ready to sail for New Orleans. How long will it take the ship to reach New Orleans? Obviously, it depended. They didn't have schedules. They were not under steam. It is a sailing ship, so you can guesstimate that the average sailing time was about 3 weeks from port to port. The anticipation was that this would be an unbroken voyage, and the term breakage means interruption, and that's going to be important if we get to the court cases that involve this ship as well. Okay? So about 3 weeks at sea, you can figure, from Richmond, Virginia to New Orleans. Pretty much that's going to be the length of time. Now, if you look at the slaves, I'm not going to list all the slaves, but there are bona fide 19 slaves involved in the revolt as it will develop. All of them are going to be male, and from what we can tell, all of them are going to be young. Not kids, but young men, obviously in their physical prime, for obvious reasons. The three names that I have put up, the most important character, and the one guy I hope you carry out of here, is Madison Washington. Madison Washington is, without question, one of the most interesting and important characters in American slave history. He is not in the same category as Frederick Douglass, although Douglass will write about him. He's not in the same category as William Wells Brown, although Brown will write about him, because those are guys who obviously wrote and who obviously became famous figures in American history. Madison Washington disappears from history, and we'll be discussing that. But there seems no doubt that Madison Washington, in fact, was the individual from which this entire slave insurrection sprang. Insurrection, thumb slapper. I've got to stop doing that. That's not right. So if we look at it again, Madison Washington, what do we know about him? The answer is we know very, very little about him. Very little about him. Here's what we think happened. Madison Washington was a slave. He was held in slavery. Somehow he escaped. And so you know there were a whole variety of ways in which individuals might escape from the institution of slavery. We don't know how it happened, but he did make his way, as many slaves did, through the northern part of the United States and ended up in Canada. How long he was in Canada remains uncertain, but there seems to be evidence that he was in contact with other abolitionists, white abolitionists, both American and Canadian, while he was in Canada. And again, for those of you who are students, remember that Canada at this time is adjunct to what empire? The British Empire, right? And Britain had outlawed slavery. So you got to Canada, and similarly, we get to the Bahamas, where our story is telling us, which is owned by Great Britain, another colony of Great Britain. You're free, right? You don't have to pass go, you don't have to collect your $200, but you're free, okay? Okay, so Madison Washington, he goes to Canada, and now the story takes a very dramatic and romantic turn, because we have no confirmation of this, but it is alleged that he had left a wife on the plantation in Virginia. And at some point he makes a decision that he's going to return to Virginia. Historians still debate whether he really had a wife there, exactly what the situation was. A lot of the romance was built up through subsequent fictional writings by people like Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, and others. But for whatever reason, something drew him back from freedom in Canada and brought him back to Virginia. When he returns to Virginia, eventually he is going to be recaptured and once again, obviously, thrown into bondage. At that point, he eventually will be sold to McCargo. And that's how he ends up on the slave ship Creole, because he's part of the party which is going to be shipped from Richmond, Virginia, down south, and sold into what amounts to the cotton fields of the New South. The others I'll get to in time, but Madison Washington, again, a remarkable guy, a remarkable figure, and we'll be coming back to him for a couple other reasons fairly quickly. Let's talk about those numbers now. The numbers are tricky, and the reason the numbers are tricky is all historical sources seem to agree that there were 135 slaves aboard the Creole. Roughly 2/3 of those who were aboard the Creole were male, which means 1/3 remaining females and children. However, and I get ahead of myself a little bit here as I describe this to you, when the Creole leaves Richmond, it doesn't sail straight down the James into Chesapeake Bay and make a right-hand turn into the Atlantic Ocean. That's not what it does. The ship takes almost a week to make its way from Richmond into the ocean. And we have, based on testimony, and I have a source down there for you guys if you want to check it out, when you get to the actual testimony which was given by the crew, it's obvious that the ship was like a bus. It stopped periodically along the way as it made its way down the James. And what's interesting about that is that Ensor himself, and I put his name on the board because Captain Robert Ensor is the master of the ship. He is captain of the ship. Ensor leaves the ship, goes off, and comes back with more slaves. So even though even though the official tally is 135 slaves aboard the ship, apparently during the court cases later on, there was a guesstimate that the real number might have been as much as 185. It's crowded. It's a crowded ship. But look, bodies are money. The more you can take aboard, and you figure you're going to get them there safely, again, it's not the Middle Passage, the more money you're going to make. And probably Ensor was in on that as well. So he was not hesitating to take aboard more slaves if possible, which is really an interesting concept when you think about it. And by the way, the other thing that's interesting is this ship was almost all ships were overloaded at this time. They went way out of bounds of what marine law allowed, because I think that the rule at that time was 2 passengers for every 5 tons. Well, do the math. If you've got a ship which weighs less than 160 tons, you're talking about a relatively small number of people who could be held aboard that ship. They're well overloaded, but they're not going to founder. I mean, it's calm weather. We have reports that the weather was fairly calm, things of that nature. So these people go aboard the Creole, and they get aboard the Creole in late October. And again, they take about a week or so to actually hit the open ocean. And what they do then is they come down this way and they start down this way. And there's no breakage in the voyage. So the ship goes this way, and it's very calm. I mean, it's calm not just the weather, but the disposition of those aboard. There's absolutely no indication given when we read the depositions taken of the crew. They're taken almost immediately when they eventually are put ashore in Nassau in the Bahamas, right? So when they actually start this voyage, it's a very, very calm voyage. They get down off of the area here. If you can look very closely, you'll see these are the northwestern part of the Bahamas, and Great Abaco Island is one of those islands there. So the ship is actually headed down this way, and what its plan is to go right into the Florida Straits, which in those days sailors called the hole in the wall, because obviously it came between Cuba and the Bahamas and Florida. But it doesn't get there. Something happens. And what happens is, again, is probably one of the most dramatic and now one of the most conjectural aspects in American slave history, because what actually happens at that point is that the female slaves and most of the children were kept here. The male slaves were kept in this section here. We can anticipate probably when they were not equal size because the number of people housed was not equal either. Interestingly, we also know that there were 5 slaves, or either 4 or 5 slaves, who were not to be found in the hold at all. Now, these were women who were kept for quote-unquote housekeeping purposes by the crew. I've got to put 2 and 2 together here for you here, because what I've read is really open to conjecture. It seems more likely that these women were in fact not in the cabins per se. One older male definitely was. He was Thomas McCargo's personal slave, as it were, but he was an older man. So he was probably there for a reason. When I get to the other characters, you'll see why. But apparently, another 4 or 5 women, in fact, were doing this housekeeping duty. In fact, they probably functioned as wives for the crew, and I'm willing to buy that in fact, they were there for sexual activity, involving themselves with the crew. Some historians seem to feel that that was the primary purpose of this. It was one of the perks of being on the ship and moving these people that way. At the same time, interestingly, one of them had a child, and there's strong evidence when you read it is fairly strong, is that the child is not permitted to be with his mother, but is kept with the slave women in their section of the hold, which would indicate that something else was going on here with these women in contact with the crew, such as it was. So we get to the night of November 7th, and apparently it's very calm and it's very dark. Now, here's the rest of the players, because they are going to be important. The whites aboard. The crew members, we know their names, they're not that important. It's not important. Ensor is the captain. Interestingly, and this was typical for voyages at this particular time, Ensor is going to have aboard his wife, his child, and his niece. So this kind of takes an interesting turn as well, because you can imagine with your wife, your child, and your niece aboard, he's going to probably keep a relative level of decorum, especially among the crew, which can be real rough, as you probably know, and possibly some of the other mates who are aboard, some of the other officers of the ship who are aboard. So he's got his whole family, right? Or as they say in Japanese, mishpucha. They're aboard at this time. The first mate is a fellow by the name of Zephaniah Gifford. He's first mate. Second mate is a fellow by the name of Lucius Stevens. Then interestingly, Thomas McCargo wants to break his nephew into the business. So he's a young guy, probably a teenager, but he brings Theophilus McCargo aboard. But McCargo is not the kind of guy who's going to be in charge of this kind of property with this kind of value, obviously, because we're talking big money here. And I'll get to that part of the story as well. So there's two other men, grown men, experienced men, who are also aboard, who are worth noting. Overall, the guy who had charge, as it were, of all the slaves aboard the ship was a fellow by the name of William Merritt. But McCargo, probably because he had enough slaves aboard, because this guy was actually going to be in charge when they got to New Orleans, and he had his own nephew aboard the ship, he has brought a man aboard to watch his own property, and that man's name is John Hewell. John Hewell. So the cast of characters now. What happens? High drama on the high seas. It's the night of November 7th. Madison Washington was slave cook. That was his duty. He cooked for the slaves. Traditionally, the slaves aboard these ships in transport were fed twice a day. They were fed a meal kind of mid-morning, around 10 o'clock, and they usually were fed again in the late afternoon, probably around 5 o'clock. Being in the position of slave cook, it kept Madison Washington in contact, almost certainly, on the deck with almost everyone. He knew the layout of the ship, he knew what was going on, he knew where the white officers and the passengers were. He probably also had certain contact with them, maybe casual conversation, things of that nature. So he's in a position to exercise his authority probably more than anyone else. It's a clever move. Why he was made slave cook, we have no idea. But they could not have made a worse decision in terms of what's going to happen next. And by the way, most cooking would have been done on deck, because remember, these are wooden ships and iron men, not the other way around. So as a result of that, you wind up with fire is always the great danger for any ship in this period, still is, but especially with wood. So cooking was probably going to be done on deck, but it was a calm voyage, so they probably did in fact cook on deck virtually all the time. They're not faced with huge storms or anything. There's no indication that there was any problems whatsoever on the voyage. It's a dark night. It's not a stormy night. It's not a dark and stormy night. It's just a dark night. Something happens. What happens is that apparently some slave comes to the first mate, Zephaniah Gifford, and says, Mr. Gifford, there is a slave among the women. Now, this was taboo. It was okay, I guess, for the crew to have their way with some of the attractive slave women, but you didn't want any of the slave males in the female section of the hold. And the reasons that were ostensibly given were, number one, obviously, they were concerned of impregnation, and number two, transmission of venereal disease. So the social atmosphere on the ship, was no shuffleboard, no lounge show, no poolside party. The disposition on the ship was you could, in fact, mix and mingle on the deck, but when you were below deck, there was to be a strict segregation by gender. So as soon as Zephaniah Gifford hears that there is a slave, male slave, in the female quarters, he goes over, and he's assisted now by Merritt, I believe. I'm not going to worry about the notes. I think it doesn't matter. Merritt, I believe, who was over there. And they go down. They lift up the hatch. Now remember, it's a dark night. They do have a lantern. They pass a lantern down. He goes down, and who does he find to his surprise? But Madison Washington. And at that point, he says something to the effect of, what did they call him? They called him a doctor, probably because he was literate. Typical term in those days, any black who could read or write called doctor. But then he says something to the effect of, Doctor, I'm surprised to find you here. And at that point, Madison Washington says something to the effect of, I must leave, or I must go. Now this is all reported through the depositions. We have no depositions from the slaves. We have to go on the basis of what the whites wrote. And we have to read between the lines a little bit, maybe a lot. End result of this is, Madison Washington physically bowls this one guy aside, heads up the ladder onto the deck, Apparently, Merritt tries to stop him. Madison Washington is a big guy. I mean, he's essentially a fullback. He's coming up under full steam. He knocks Merritt over, and then allegedly, he runs to the forward hatch here, and he says something to the effect of, "Come on, boys, we have begun. We must now go through with it." Now, keep in mind that we're dealing with a time and an era of great melodrama, and we know the writing was flowery, and it was so you get these depositions where they give you this entire long soliloquy, where he also said, "And for those of you who don't come along and join me in this revolt, I will see you dead." Well, it's unlikely they remembered that, let alone that he actually said it. But it does seem reasonable that he did burst onto the deck, that this plan had been put in place, because almost immediately, as soon as the grate is opened up and the other slaves are released, apparently, eventually, some 18 other men come charging onto the deck, and then it's all on. Then it's all on. Now, this gets very confusing, and I'm not going to go over the nuance of all this because you really got to be an aficionado to get into what happened to who and when. But the important thing to remember is that in the dark, these slaves start to fan out over the deck. So some of them undoubtedly are moving forward into the forecastle area because they want to corral the crew. Others are clearly rushing into the stern area because that's the cabin area, the stateroom area, where we find the captain and the other officers and the other white passengers. And in the dark, it's total confusion. Allegedly, a slave fired a firearm and actually wounded Merritt. It seems possible that this happened because later on, one of the interesting things that evolves when we get to the depositions and the cases is that there was no TSA. It was pretty much up to the captain and up to the crew to decide, well, how much security do we want aboard this ship? Well, consider where we're going with this. It's very clear that these slaves were never shackled, ever. They had literally free run of the ship, number one. Number two, apparently coming aboard, the crew even said we really didn't make a very careful inspection of their baggage when they came aboard. So is it possible that a slave, or Madison Washington himself, actually had smuggled a firearm aboard? That remains possible, and the round very well may have been fired by a slave. The other possibility is, in fact, that the round was fired by a member of the crew, or by someone who obviously missed the slave he was aiming at, and wounded the mate. So we don't know. But now it's all on. It's a very dark night. It's pure chaos in the stateroom area, pure chaos on the deck of the ship. In some cases, in a small ship, and remember, we're not talking a ship that's all that much longer than the full length of this room and a few feet more. It's altogether possible that at this point in the chaos, that whites are running past blacks, blacks are running past whites, and in the hysteria of the moment, nobody really knows who is who until you literally bump into somebody. So nobody knows the length of time, but it probably only took maybe 30 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes, before essentially most of the crew is rounded up. Now the stateroom issue is a little different. There's only going to be one fatality in this insurrection, in this successful revolt. And that fatality is going to be John Huell, who is the slave superintendent for McCargo's slaves. Apparently, he puts up a fight. He ultimately is not going to be shot, but will be stabbed repeatedly, will stagger back into one of the staterooms, falls back into a bunk, and essentially says, "They've killed me," and he was right, they did. He's dead. He's the only fatality. However, Ensor, the captain of the ship, has come on deck. He is also wounded, badly wounded. So his answer is that he climbs the rigging, right? He climbs up into the mast. Now this is dramatic stuff. So you can imagine, he's up there, he's probably bleeding, the blood's dropping down on the deck. He's climbed as fast and as far as he possibly can. At the same time, his mate eventually, and again I'm not going on my notes here, but I believe it's Merritt, also heads for the rigging. And he ties the captain into the rigging, realizing that this guy literally could fall to his death because he's so badly wounded, right? From whence comes, of course, the saying what? Anybody familiar with the Australian sailing saying? Two things never permitted on a sailing ship in Australia. There's no friggin' in the rigging and no wanking on the planking. So, as a result of this, trying to work humor into a topic of a slave revolt is not easy. As a result of all this, you have the slaves who have taken command of the ship. The second mate is down below. He is a prisoner, And that means that Lucius Stevens, more or less, is in command of the ship. Now, this is where the story, I think, takes its most interesting and dramatic turn. The other two slaves that I put on the board for you, Ben Blacksmith and Elijah Morris, clearly want to dispose of the crew. They want revenge. They're willing to go about the business. Their rage has gotten to the point where it seems to supersede all else. It is, by all accounts, when you think about it, it is the effect of Madison Washington on them, taking clear command and essentially saying, keep your eye on the prize. So that there will be no more violence on this ship after the initial insurrection and essentially the taking of the vessel itself. And that's important later on, but I will save a couple minutes to read something to you from this proposed paper that I'm working on. Ultimately what happens, to skip to the chase here, is that the ship, having been taken by the slaves, an agreement is made. How many people here are familiar either with the movie or the books printed about the Amistad? Sometimes it's a parallel, but it's not really a parallel. And very quickly, for any of you that are not aware of it, Steven Spielberg's movie a few years ago, the Amistad Revolt, just a couple of years before this. But the big difference is the Amistad, first of all, was sailing on what amounts to a coastwise cruise off of Cuba with slaves which were allegedly taken illegally from Africa. And when they revolted and took the ship, they wanted to go back to Africa, Sintu and the others aboard. They didn't. They wound up essentially being hoodwinked, and the ship drifts north and actually winds up put off Long Island, New York. So it becomes an American case that way. But that's not the case here. In this revolt, this is an American ship on an American voyage with American crew and American slaves, essentially. The whole thing deals with America, but now Madison Washington makes, again, a fateful decision. Initially, some people said, let's go back to Africa. And they realize they're on this little ship, they don't have the supplies, they don't have the ability, but they realize they're right off the Bahamas. And there flies the Union Jack. And where flies the Union Jack? We have freedom. So what do? He says, let's go to Nassau. And when we get there, we go over to Paradise Island and hit Club Med. Yeah. So when they actually get into Nassau, and on the 9th, the ship will sail into Nassau, then this becomes an international incident, and again, another phase in this amazing drama. Almost immediately, obviously, the news comes that this is a ship which has been taken by slaves, that the white crew is now, in essence, they are prisoners aboard the ship. Out come the British authorities. The most important of these British authorities that actually comes out to the ship is His Majesty's Attorney General in the Bahamas, George Anderson. George Anderson comes out, again, long story, he brings out soldiers with him, they all come aboard the ship. The crew, Ensor is down, obviously, he's badly wounded, but he will survive. The crew says, oh, we've had this revolt, arrest these people and give us our ship back and we want to continue our voyage. And of course, Anderson says, not so fast, not so fast. So what he does is he's taking control of the ship with British soldiers who are now on the decks. All the slaves are still aboard, the crew is still aboard. But the other guy who obviously is getting engaged very quickly, because one of the officers does go ashore and he runs to the American consul. He says, help, help. We've been subject to this insurrection aboard the ship, a rebellion. They've taken the ship, and now you've got to work for us and get us all free. Well, this guy's name is John Bacon. He knows that his fat is in the fire. And Bacon is going to work really hard to try to force the British authorities to recognize that this insurrection is illegal. The ship, its passengers, and the slaves should be permitted to continue this broken voyage and end up in New Orleans. The British colonial governor, who is Coburn, Francis Coburn, he says no. Very clearly, according to British law, remember, in Great Britain, slavery had been outlawed. In the Empire, it had been outlawed. And he sees these individuals essentially as simply slaves who have been fighting for their freedom, and having won their freedom, that they are entitled to realize liberty. Now, he doesn't say that for the 19 mutineers. What he does do is he says, you guys are not free right now. Because you guys, there's a question about what you did and how you did it. But the rest of you may go. And so the rest of them, in fact, do leave the ship, except there's a tag there, which I'll get to in the story. However, what happens is the 19 others are taken into a prison setting, and they are held in a prison setting. Well, wouldn't you know it, there's even more drama. Before anybody leaves the ship, the crew of the Creole, especially the officers, try to get together with the other American vessels and to retake the Creole by force of arms. In other words, American sailors retaking an American ship back from the bad old British, who after all had just freed these slaves. They know they're going to be ashore and go free. But the British soldiers aboard the ship anchored out here in Nassau Harbor, as soon as they see what's going on, they just level muskets and bayonets at these guys and say, stay away, or we're going to shoot your ass, basically is what they say. So the Americans split. They say, that's it. That's it. We can't retake the ship. At that point, any hope of continuing this voyage with those aboard is ended. The slaves will leave the ship. The 19 mutineers will, in fact, called mutineers, are going to be incarcerated. They will be held for a short period of time, at which time the British authorities come to the conclusion that, in fact, that they had acted not under essentially the auspices of piracy, but simply had taken the ship to gain their own freedom, and that under British law, that these people are free. Now, Coburn knows he's dealing with a hot potato here. This is now an international incident. So almost immediately, we have records of at least 2 ships who take most of those former slaves and transport them from Nassau to Jamaica, where they disappear in history. Although I was on the trail, but I couldn't get a grant, didn't try that hard, but I would be glad to go to Jamaica and check it out and spend a few days at Otros Rios. What happens to the ship? The ship then, with the crew aboard, will continue the voyage and will wind up in New Orleans. Now here's an interesting tag that I come back to, and that is that in fact, 5 of the slaves continue on with the ship. They did not leave the ship offered their freedom. Nobody else came back. These 5 apparently never really left the ship. It's unknown as to why this was the case, but it seems likely that these were women, and again, at least 1 child. And what went on aboard the ship, we don't know, but they eventually were delivered into bondage. And again, as far as I know, they disappear from history as well. So the ship reaches New Orleans finally in December of 1841. And then, of course, the American press is going bonkers. As you can imagine, Southern politicians, slave owners, the journalists of the South are furious about this event. In a sense, we always have this knee-jerk reaction back to the War of 1812, back to the concept of, about stocking ships on the high seas, not impressment per se. And so as a result of this, there is this very short, sharp war fever which grips the United States. However, calmer heads will prevail. And eventually what's going to happen is that the Secretary of State, I didn't put him up, but it's Daniel Webster. We know that Webster, who's a Northerner, but obviously has to work with the South and sees advantages to doing so, is going to write letters of protest to the British government, to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. And so for a period of about 6 months, it's going to be really fairly intense. Well, what's going to happen ultimately is, and again, those of you who are scholars here in American history, and those of you who are also interested parties, you know that eventually Webster is going to get together with Lord Ashburton. So Lord Ashburton and Webster are going to get together, and they're going to draw up this very profitable treaty for both sides. Well, one of the issues that comes up is, and it's a sore spot, is, well, what about the Creole? And essentially they have to agree to disagree. And what they do is they slip language into the treaty itself that Britain, and I'll see if I can give you a direct quote on this, because it's interesting language. Bear with me for just a second. That Britain will refrain from officious interference with American vessels in the future. So what they have done is they have made it as nebulous, as general as they possibly can. They want to get over this. They have more fish to fry regarding territorial issues and trade issues. And so as a result of that, it holds for the time being. Now, the final disposition of this is 2 prongs. Number 1, in the 1850s, a claims commission will award for lost property. And remember, slaves are first and foremost property. They will award for lost property $110,000. Great Britain will, for lost property. Very quiet, but it's done, so there's a sense of compensation. That compensation goes to the United States. The presumption is it went to the United States and somehow found its way to those who were actually the slave owners. So that was one outcome. But there's another outcome which is worth discussing for just a minute or two, and that is, just as you or I insure our car or our house, these guys, the slave owners, insure their slaves. Interestingly, if you want to know what it was worth, and they were underinsured because you're not insuring for full value, as we know, just as we don't really insure most of us don't insure our houses or our cars for full value, right? The slaves were insured for $800. The expected selling price, each. The The expected selling price would be over $1,000 probably in the slave markets of New Orleans. So what happens? Can you see where we're going with this? You've got this massive loss, essentially, of labor and obviously of chattel. So the owners come back and they sue the various insurance companies who had written the policies. And there's something like 8 cases which are actually going to be decided in regard to the insurrection aboard the Creole. And I believe 6 of the 8 are found in favor of the defendants. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the state of Louisiana. And very clearly, the insurance companies have written the policies. Does this sound familiar after what we've just gone through? Either on the Gulf Coast or here with our Great Fire in the East County. The insurance companies wrote the policies in such a way that breakage of the voyage was to be covered, but not in case of insurrection. Okay? So the argument was, well, what caused the breakage of this voyage? Was it the fact that Madison Washington and the slaves had revolted aboard the Creole at sea, or was it the fault of the British? Because if you found that the British had been the cause of the interruption in the voyage, then technically these insurance companies were on the hook. The court said no. The cause of the breakage was the insurrection. Insurrection is excluded in causation in these policies. You guys are out of luck. Now, in 2 cases, it was decided differently, because clearly in those 2 cases, the insurance company had included insurrection or something along those lines, right? So we can see where that goes. So they won those particular claims. So these people were simply out of luck. Before I get to reading, because I do want to take questions, but before I get to reading, I want to make something really clear to everyone, and that is this is a unique event in American history. This is a truly unique event in American history. To me, it's one of the most dramatic and amazing events in American history, because when I get to the reading, you'll see why. But do you notice the control that's exhibited in this revolt? And to me, that's important. Because, and I will get to this in the paper, but if you think about slave revolt motivation, you may think about it, as I'll describe it, being on a continuum. On one end, what you've really got is hope and liberty. On the other side, what you've got essentially is rage, violence, and presumably death. So what you see aboard the Creole in particular is that here you had a charismatic leader, a guy who almost certainly had this thing planned out during the voyage going south. Once he had identified the individuals that he wanted to involve in this thing, he had set this thing up in such a way that he knew, like a good gambler, the odds are finally in my favor. We've got just about everything going for us. We've got a contained situation. This is another paper I'm going to work on. We've got a contained situation. We've got numerical advantage. We've got essentially tactical advantage in terms of our position on this ship. We have a really good chance of being successful in this thing. Now, there were other slave revolts which were, shall we say, unactualized at sea. Simon Northup, has anybody followed his 12 Years a Slave? Well, again, it's a little bit suspicious because he was sailing the same route and probably had read about this. So he writes about his experience and how he planned the same sort of revolt. I remain a little suspicious whether this was well planned. It never happened. But you do get the feeling that individuals in this position were prepared to do this. What's amazing is, unlike what happened on the Amistad, in this particular case, Madison Washington took control, said, that's enough. Let's keep our eye on the prize. The prize is our liberty. We have everything going for us now. Let's go for it. So as a result, you have this remarkable situation where you only have one individual who actually loses his life. Ultimately, by the way, one of the other slaves will die, probably from the wounds incurred during the revolt itself. But by and large, everyone walks off that ship in pretty good shape in Nassau. And most of the whites obviously return uninjured to their port as well. And this is truly extraordinary in the history of American slavery. And I'll get to this again, but it's always been taken as a mantra. There never was a successful slave revolt. Well, you better qualify that. Because you've just heard about probably, if not the most, one of the most, no, I'll say the most successful slave revolts in American history. And that's why everybody was so excited about it. Abolitionists, freed blacks, even though slaves had heard about it, because they said this really happened. This occurred. Okay. Okay. I wanted to finish doing this. And again, this is not really an abstract. But this gives you an idea, and I want you to think about it, because I've been thinking about it. And this you don't have. It's not on that sheet. I'm going to read from this. It's just a page and a half. And I'll end with this and then open it up to questions. And by the way, after the questions, I am being feted over in the formal faculty dining room with a lobster thermidor, bisque, and white wine reception, which you are all invited to. 3 questions I've asked myself regarding American slave revolts over the past several years are: 1, are conventional theories concerning causation and goals of slave rebellion uniformly accurate? This is a political scientist. 2, if the goal of the slave revolt was primarily a struggle for liberty, was revolt the most effective way of achieving liberty? And 3, were the leaders of slave revolts and slave followers always headed towards the same goal? Okay? My inclination is to answer each of these questions as follows. 1, conventional theories regarding rebellion and the imperative of liberty as a primary goal of insurrection are not uniformly accurate. 2, if liberty was the great hope for the slave, better options, long odds as they were, provided a better chance, i.e. running away, purchasing freedom, or waiting for manumission. 3, liberty, while undeniably a goal of the slave revolt, was often secondary to an agenda of rage, violence, and revenge for its own sake against the master class. And slave leaders, as well as their top lieutenants, knew this on an explicit basis in planning and or executing those revolts. Okay? So now I'm going off into fairly novel land. Kenneth Stamp said, Kenneth Stamp again, his masterwork from 40 years ago, 45 years ago now, by Peculiar Institution. Interestingly, Kenneth Stamp said, in truth, no slave uprising ever had a chance of ultimate success, even though it might have cost the master class heavy casualties, end quote. 2 things should be noted here. First, as we have seen via the Creole, a truly successful slave revolt was possible given a set of conditions which favored the slaves instead of the masters, and a clear vision of mission, which was to liberate the slave. But second, Stamp directly associates failure with the notion of a defeated effort at liberty, while ironically perhaps putting his finger on a real and achievable goal, which was the satisfying outcome of inflicting pain and death on the master class. Since most slaves did not enjoy the advantage of numbers or favorable circumstances in the midst of revolt, it is interesting to observe that on at least one occasion when a sword of victory was within their grasp, the movement faltered. During the Stono Uprising in South Carolina in 1739, after an initial bloody success in rampaging and killing whites, the 60 to 100 slaves paused in an open field, according to historian Peter Wood, where they set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Negroes to them. Wood surmises, and I quote, the main reason for not crossing the Edisto River was probably the realistic expectation that by remaining stationary after such an initial show of force, enough slaves could join them to make their troop nearly invincible by morning, end quote. But it raises the question of why this group, so close to Spanish Florida, which clearly welcomed runaway slaves and encouraged the practice, decided not to make a break for freedom, but instead continued what amounts to a slave-led military campaign. An alternative explanation of this behavior may be found in Conrad Lorenz's On Aggression, where he has noted, and again I quote Lorenz, the presence of many other individuals, all agitated by the same emotion, has a certain influence on the quality of response. Smaller numbers at issue with a large majority tend to obstinate defense with the emotional value of, quote, making a last stand, end quote. Thus it remains at least a strong possibility that freedom in the long run was not the primary objective of this particular uprising. Only half a page to go, almost. Finally, if we put slave revolt on a linear continuum, which we just mentioned, with rage and revenge on one side and hope and liberty on the other, an argument can be advanced that in several actualized or attempted slave insurrections, the goals of the leaders tended to the former, in other words, rage and rebellion, while those who were following had a belief in the latter. In other words, some slaves were willing to go along with the program with the belief that it would ultimately result in their liberation. In order to build the necessary numbers to achieve their goal, the leaders had to throw a bone of hope to the followers. Oftentimes, this came down in the form of what today might be viewed as irrational, visionary, or mystical plans. For example, seizure of a city, taking an arsenal, or forcing white sailors aboard ships in port to sail the slaves back to Africa, etc. In the most famous confession by a slave revolt leader in American history, Nat Turner, One phrase is repeated over and over again with small deviation. I counted them. The work of death. I repeat it, quote unquote, the work of death. In his exposition, there was no discussion of serious plans for liberation and escape by Turner, but rather a clear, laser-like focus on the end product, which is to kill as many whites as possible. In only one significant spot is liberty mentioned, and that comes when the slave Will, joining the insurrection, is questioned by Nat Turner. This is a quote, I saluted them on coming up and asked Will how he came there. He said his life was worth no more than others and his liberty as dear to him. I asked him if he thought to obtain it. He said he would or lose his life, end quote. Immediately after this, Nat Turner returned to his theme, telling his fellow insurrectionists to spare no one, regardless of age or sex. Similar testimony in several other planned but unconsummated insurrections from colonial times to the Civil War indicate that the leadership and top lieutenants of these revolts were very much comfortable with the idea of the use of violence with the aim of extinguishing life rather than liberating themselves and their fellow slaves from bondage. And that's it, folks. I'm open to questions.
Well, I have a comment, I suppose. I don't think this was a slave revolt in the same sense as the Stono Rebellion or something contemplated by Denmark Vesey, which didn't happen, or Gabriel Prosser. Those guys, I think, were just as Nat Turner would indicate, were in despair of ever achieving their own liberation, and they simply wanted to take as many white lives as they could before they themselves were destroyed, right? But this was an opportunistic thing. This was in the slave revolt. You know, there they are on a ship on the high seas, and they're near the Bahamas, and all of a sudden the opportunity is in front of them to gain their freedom. So it's, you know, of course they'll take it, but it's not doesn't seem to me to be in the same category as these other slave revolts that we've spoken of. That's fine.
Yeah, it's a valid point. My response would be the location and the circumstances are different. But revolt by definition is revolt. I mean, we're talking about the use of force and violence in order to achieve sworn aims, whatever those aims particularly are. As I said, there are advantages to having a slave revolt at sea, which you don't find on the land, where numerically and geographically, essentially, you were, deep water.
Yeah.
I guess my answer, though, to that is that there still had to be, and let me relate it to what I just read about Rage and Rebellion. And one of the interesting things that one runs across when we talk about this, and the large numbers of people who were brought into some of these, like the Vesey Revolt, right, Prosser, these large numbers of people who ultimately were supposedly associated with this, you almost get a shamanistic element to it, where the leadership recognized what rational person is going to look at the situation and join me unless I can hold out, essentially, the hope of ultimate liberation, the realization of one's freedom. I think that in some of these revolts, almost all of which were unrealized, Nat Turner being the big exception, but in almost all of these revolts, there seems to be, shall we say, an inner circle of ringleaders and leadership organized along a semi-military basis, command and control, but that those who were expected to go along with the program, in fact, on the outer circle, were expected to go along, but in many, not all, but in many cases, coerced, essentially, by this remarkable vision of what the outcome was going to be. The other thing is that comes across in a variety of testimony from all kinds of slave revolts, and it's very interesting. There's a whole pattern which emerges here is that there is almost as much rage or potential rage expressed against slaves who will not join the revolt by the leadership as there is against the whites who essentially are the targets of the rebellion itself. And it comes out, the wording is almost identical. In other words, well, anybody who doesn't join us, we're just going to kill them. We're going to kill them as dead as we're going to kill the slave. And it's quite interesting and intriguing. But revolt is revolt. I'm open. Another question, comment? Yeah.
Seems to me, based on what you said, that this revolt would not have happened had not Madison Washington been on board. But is it a revolt, or is it Madison Washington's thought through scheme to regain his liberty, having lost it when he returned from Canada and Virginia? And is he on record as having ever said or written anything about his motives?
Yeah. First, there's a pattern in all revolts. And we can go, if we want to go right back to Spartacus, essentially, at that time, right? Yeah. If you go all the way back to that, you find that it takes somebody who is, number one, charismatic. And charisma seems to be the most important ingredient in all this. And that gives you entree, essentially, to leadership capacity, to organizational capacity, and all these other things. So, had Madison Washington, it's conjecture, but I'm willing to go with the belief that had Madison Washington not been aboard this ship, probably this revolt might have been discussed but unactualized. I don't think either Ben Blacksmith or Elijah Morris or any of the other men, from the sound of it, were capable of arranging it and controlling it the way that Madison Washington did. Or had they actually been successful, it probably would have been a bloodbath aboard that ship. One has the feeling that they were prepared to kill everyone and do pretty much what the slaves aboard the Amistad did, which was, kill you, throw you overboard till you get to the last guy and say, sail us home. And clearly, Madison Washington, he's thinking not just one step ahead, he's thinking 2, 3, 4 moves ahead. He's playing chess here. How do I get my goal with the least damage, which will encourage the chances of us being able to sustain ourselves in a state of freedom? I mean, we have to get inside his head here. But this guy was pretty remarkable. I'm sorry, the second part of your question was?
Madison Washington himself, did he say or write anything for posterity as to what his motives were?
Nada. We have absolutely no record, any record. And if I had my druthers, again, I have the suspicion that if you could get into the records, and I do have some interesting correspondence with the government of Jamaica, and I have a feeling that if you can get down there, and if you have the time, if I could get myself off the beach, I would probably go into the archives, and you might be able to either track back and see what happened after this group arrived in Jamaica, and possibly go back into the Jamaican publications at the time, and I couldn't find anything with what was available here, and see if you could not bring up some record of what happened to him, or perhaps somebody who tracked him, which might be an inclination of what he had to say about it. But remember that we don't really have a lot of slave revolt testimony from the side of the slave. That's why Nat Turner's confession was so important, with all of its failings with Thomas Gray and how much did he invent and what did he plug in. But we have to believe that the kernel of what Turner had to say is probably accurate. And so therefore, to me, it's very interesting. That's why I bring it up. I counted 4 different occasions in that confession, which is not that long, it's a few pages long, where the repeat of the phrase, and it caught my eye years ago, which has really got me involved in this, the work of death, the work of death, the work of death. I was looking for words like liberty, freedom, escape, you see, but we didn't see that. And to get back to your thing, which is valid, and what I mentioned in the paper, which was, slaves that wanted to run away, usually young males who wanted to run away, for any number of purposes, whether they ran a few miles or whether they wanted to make it all the way to Canada. If you think about it, if you're rolling the dice, your odds are probably a lot better achieving your freedom by doing that than by trying to pick up a sword or a gun and fight your way to freedom and cut your way to freedom through what amounts to the overwhelming numbers and the armament of the master class. So this is what kind of leads me down this track where it seems as if Nat Turner, with his visions and his mysticism and his religion, I won't go into that now, but all this was designed essentially, he was on the mission of the fanatic, and it was very clear where he was going. I have a professor friend who says, there's a moral here for what's going on in the world today when we talk about religious fanaticism, whether it's in the Muslim world or it's in the Christian world, right? So, but the reality is that it seems that this is where this guy was going, and yet Madison Washington was going a different direction altogether.
Do you feel that there might have been, in actuality, a number of other situations where the slaves could have easily overpowered the number of whites, but that it was almost that they were psychologically kept fettered as much as they were physically kept in check, and so that there was less successful revolts or escape because of the psychological mechanisms in place? Or is it really they just had power over them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is a complex question, and it's hard to answer it completely because obviously, as Stamp and others have pointed out, the entire institution of slavery was designed to keep the slave in awe, to keep the slave in the position of the Sambo, the theory of Sambo, to keep the slave essentially subjugated. And when I say the slave, I'm talking primarily about the male slave, because there's no indication, I've never seen a single indication where women were either in a leadership position or in the inner circle. Now there is indication some of them came along, probably with their menfolk. But we're talking young males here, and all the things that go on, with testosterone. And it seems that even with all of this, there was probably also the psychological / rational aspect to the slave revolt, where people would say, we could overpower this overseer. We might even be able to take his guns away. But we know that all around us, we live in a sea, essentially, of slave catchers, militia, and people who are much better armed than we are. I'll tell you what you do find a lot, and you find it from Frederick Douglass on down, is that the slaves periodically, when a master got in his face and physically started wailing on him, the slave turned around and wailed back. I mean, there was some real bloody confrontations, but you could view that almost as self-defense, a crisis of the moment. So the answer is that slaves, generally speaking, for a variety of reasons, did not seem to react even when you would have thought it was possible. More likely, they'd run away than anything else.
Because they had a better chance of getting, because it wasn't that far to go to get free, rather than trying to overtake the white power structure.
Yeah, even if you want to go on a little slave vacation, we also have this misunderstanding about slavery and the escape. I know my fellow faculty members know what I'm going to say here, and that is there's an astonishing number of slaves who didn't only ran a few miles away, and they ran into a gully, or they ran into an area which was heavily wooded, and essentially they went on a slave holiday. And they lived there in relative freedom where they could work with the other slaves and raid the farms around there for chickens or pigs or whatever the case may be, knowing it was a very temporary affair. They were going to be punished when they came back, but they were going to be put to death. And they probably were not going to have an arm or a hand lopped off for this, but it was a way of saying, I need a break from slavery. So a lot of these folks didn't go away, and it sounds weird, they didn't go any further away than a few miles. Then we have those who obviously later on become part of the Underground Railroad and who do anything to get north and go a long way away. The other side to it, which is the most tragic part, and to the students who are unaware of this, is that when you read about runaway slaves, frequently, no, they were not going to Florida to join Seminoles, right? They were not running away to Canada. They were not going on a slave vacation, but they were in the Deep South. We have here the Cotton South, which was pretty brutal. And what they were doing was they had been transplanted, again, from the Chesapeake region, and they were running back to their old masters. They weren't really running away from slavery. They were trying to return to the life of the people they knew, which is heartbreaking when you think about it, really heartbreaking. So, I mean, yeah, there's a whole lot of reasons why, but running away as an option was probably a better option than saying, hey, let's all get together and do this and we're going to win our freedom. So the leadership had to go in for an element of charlatanism with those that were going to follow along in these impossible situations where it was doomed from the very beginning, just doomed from the beginning, except in the case like the Creole, which is why it's such a shining monument to well thought out, essentially well planned, well executed slave revolt. And obviously this slipshod aspect of those who were in charge of the slaves, who very clearly really did very little to control somewhere between 135 and 185 men and women and children aboard that ship. So you really don't get a real clear picture even from their depositions as to why they were so relaxed about this. There's absolutely no indication, except it sounds more, again, it sounds like a 7-day fun ship cruise. And they were just saying, well, come on aboard and we'll get you where you're going. And we'll feed you twice a day and you'll get there.
Were any of the slaves trained enough so that they could do the sailing to get them down to Nassau?
No.
Or were they going to have to depend on the white crew?
No, they depended on the white crew. And the guy who actually was at the wheel, I didn't put his name on the board, forgive me, I can't remember, but he was actually spoke French. because multinational crews in those days, and he was frightened to death. It's very clear he was scared. Anybody would, you have all these people that were your slaves, essentially the prisoners are now running the penitentiary. So he was frightened to death. But Stevens was there. Later on, they negotiate. They get the captain is brought down. The first mate comes down, and so the crew remains intact, with the understanding that probably had they tried to pull a fast one, it was made very clear if you don't do what we're telling you to do, we're going to slit your throat and throw you over. But by that point, they could actually see land. I mean, they were actually in the Bahamas, They could actually see that.
Because it seems to me that would be where the false sense of security would come from, which is we're the ones who can run the ship, which means that if there is a revolt, they're either going to have to keep us alive, or they're going to end up just drifting away. And once again, proximity to the islands would make it easier because there'd be less chance of being hoodwinked and saying, yes, we're taking you to Nassau, but instead you're heading towards Florida.
Exactly. Look at this. What would have happened had 3 or 4 days earlier the revolt taken place, instead of taking place here, had it happened off the coast of the Carolinas? Well, in a sense, that changes the equation, doesn't it? But doesn't that also speak to the planning of this? I mean, we don't know it for sure, but it would indicate that Madison Washington said, look, we've got to wait until we are close to British territory, then we'll do it. So they did.
I'm not familiar enough with the overall picture of slavery here, and the question that pops into my mind is the makeup of the slave population in this ship. How many of them were born into slavery in the country? Were there any that had been brought from Africa in their lifetimes?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I'm willing to conjecture that the overwhelming majority, if not all of the slaves aboard, were African American. When you think about the middle voyage, when you think about this, you think about naked slaves, either nude or wearing rags, whatever they've been able to take with them from their villages in West Africa, and all that. Well, these men and women come aboard with kits. I mean, they are carrying luggage. One of the things you discover is that when they get to the Bahamas, the authorities in the Bahamas say, okay, we've got the people off, now you guys, meaning the crew, unload their baggage. They're entitled to their baggage as well. Well, that would indicate really clearly that these folks were, these were pretty established individuals wherever they had come from before they got on the ship. They had, at least if not real property, they certainly had clothing. There could have been other things which were in their kits, stuff for the kids, who knows. So it's an interesting concept. But I would say they were probably, by conjecture, virtually all African American. They all would have been Americanized for generations, probably.
What was the flow? Is there what were the years when the masses were coming over? Or was there a real pattern to the immigration and that versus the population that was over?
You mean from Africa?
Yeah.
From Africa. Okay. Well, that's a topic that is a little bit beyond me. But that was all from roughly, we could say, as far as English America goes, from the latter part of, they were here at the beginning, but the latter part of the 1600s, right on through. And as my colleagues know, and as everybody knows, and as I tell my classes, all you have to do is look at cotton production with the coming of the gin in the 1790s. And as you look at cotton production, which goes like this, with the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry, well, we had white gold in this country. We had a monopoly, essentially. So cotton was, to the south, what oil is to Saudi Arabia. So here you had, essentially, a line of cotton production goes like this. Well, the number of slaves that's necessary to harvest that goes like that as well. So you have this huge influx of slaves as they come into this country. But again, where we sometimes make a mistake is we think, oh, they came directly from Africa over to either the colonies or the United States. And they did. Frequently, there were a lot of stops along the way in the Caribbean. And the majority of slaves, I do think, originally came to Brazil, which explains a lot of the population of Brazil, which, by the way, did not liberate its slaves until the 1880s. But the crew said, without any backup, that, quote unquote, the slaves came to them, because they're all walking the streets of Nassau, a small town, and saying, oh, we want to go back aboard the ship. We want to go back aboard the ship. Well, if you believe that, I'll sell you a bridge. Because the proof is in the pudding, that only the 5 or so slaves continued on this voyage, the broken voyage. Everybody else said, sayonara, we're free, and we're going to stay free.
I've actually been stuck on those 5 people for a while. because it's such a human interest thing, who they were who decided to, throw in their bait with their masters. So you were saying that they were probably the women who may have thought of themselves as wives, and then were, dumped as slaves when they got to their destination?
We don't know.
But
There
there's
is the name of one of those women, and clearly, apparently it's the same woman who had the boy, who stayed in the female hold when she was with the crew. And apparently she and her son are 2 of the 5 that continue on that voyage.
because they thought they had a
But
family
there's
relationship.
but there's definitely record that they're then sold.
I haven't found any.
Oh, okay, because if there's no record that they're sold, they may have in fact been mistresses and common-law wives and things like that.
But let me answer that. The tradition was that it was easy pickings on these ships.
Yeah.
So the crew is watching these women come aboard and sort of making up their mind, well, this one will keep house for us, which probably means will sleep with me for the duration of the voyage. And then having reached their destination, this woman is almost certainly going to be sold into slavery. She's just been a concubine for a relatively short period of time while this voyage is going on.
You'd think that, except for the fact that she continues unless she was coerced. That's what I'm wondering. You'd have to look, what would be interesting is to see if there were shipboard manifests before, because she could show up in previous or subsequent trips because she's simply being
Right.
taken back and forth.
Right.
One of the characters that you mentioned, the captain's personal slave, the older man.
Wasn't the captain's?
Oh,
The
captain.
older man was the slave property of Thomas
That was
McCargo.
McCargo. So what happened to him? Does anybody know?
The presumption is that he got off and disappeared. Because there's no sign that he continued on that voyage, the return voyage to New Orleans. And it seems likely that he lucked out because a couple of things probably happened. Number one, with the young nephew aboard, so he might have been acting sort of like the manservant for the young male aboard. The other possibility, which kind of rings true, is that given that it took there were 2 venues, you sold slaves up in Richmond and you sold them in New Orleans or Natchez. So it's possible that McCargo, I have no way of knowing this, McCargo was planning on saying, I'll follow you, meaning overland probably, or maybe by ship. So he was kind of moving his personal slave, his servant down there, to be in a position so that when he set up household, that guy would be in place to run his household in Deep South. So it cost him. I'm sure the old man was probably, he was an older man, he was probably delighted. By the way, we do have in the testimony, we do have the record where in fact the manservant, the older man, did plead for the lives, essentially, of the family, of Theophilus, McCargo, and these other guys around the stateroom area where they were held. So it wasn't as if he was now all of a sudden, yeah, kill him. But and maybe that was a clever ruse too, because he's thinking to himself, well, if this doesn't work out, at least the kid is going to tell the old man, that I did the job for him. But it also is possible that in fact that, he had cordial relations with the whites aboard and he didn't want to see any more bloodshed either. And so there's an element that he had pleaded their case, or pled their case, as it were, as well. This almost really reeks of, when you think about it, of incompetence on the part of the crew and the slave overseers. And I can't speak for the crew. The overseers were a pretty rough bunch of guys. They were always suspicious, generally speaking, of slave behavior. So it seems very, very strange that once they got aboard the ship, they went gaga. They just sort of said, oh, well, we're aboard the ship, what can go wrong? Well, we know what went wrong. I think that it's conjecture, but let's imagine that getting on the ship within the first, just sailing down the James, if they had seen a bunch of males, surly African-American males, standing on the deck, looking like this and muttering, my guess is that probably they would have said, uh-oh, this could be problems. I'm guessing that Madison Washington said nothing about this initially, and then in the hold and in the privacy and the quiet, where he was alone with his fellow slaves, he probably said, we can pull this off. We can do this. And it didn't take weeks to do, but in a matter perhaps of just a few days, they worked out the details of where we go, what we do, and how we're going to react.
And again, with regard to attitude, Madison Washington, having been a free person, having tasted freedom, would be more likely to organize a revolt than people who had been mentally down their entire lives.
Right, held in bondage the full lifetime. Yeah. Well, and of course that's the great mystery. You say you're a free man. What drew you back? And that's where the romance again of his wife, or at least of friends. I mean, it's a very dramatic story. Now, for those of you that are interested, it was in fact Frederick Douglass who wrote his fictionalized version of this called The Heroic Slave. If anybody is interested in the literature, you don't treat it as history because it is fictionalized. But in The Heroic Slave, it's very clear, Douglas draws Madison Washington as this, you can just see somebody like Denzel Washington playing the role, I mean really, this bold, brave, intelligent, handsome guy who's come back essentially to rescue his wife. Now what they do is they invent, they say, well his wife was aboard the ship with him, and that is virtually certainly not so. But again, you have all this romance and this drama occurring. So it's right up there in any story.
Is it possible that it's like a psychological thing, like, prisoners get out of prison and they have to get themselves back into prison because they were so used to the lifestyle, they couldn't adapt to life outside of it. And that might have drawn them back, and they couldn't adapt to life outside of it.
And you bring up, that's an interesting point. Notice one of the issues I have is I'm kind of interdisciplinary, I'm not a psychologist. But you've got to deal not just with history here, but with psychology. In this case, I don't think that he wanted to return to slavery. I think he really had a goal in coming back. But if you say, was it difficult for people to adjust to freedom? Well, look at what happened at the end of the Civil War, when essentially, you passed the 13th Amendment and everybody is free. Suddenly you've gone from a state of generational bondage to a state of instant liberty. And that's going to cause, well, problems which we're still faced with today, essentially. Ramifications of what happens to an entire community that faces this. So I think that's a valid point. But in this case, this particular case, I don't think he was really looking for a return to bondage.
The morality of the North versus the South, or those who, even in that time, in that day, opposed slavery and saw it as something horrific, cruel, inhumane, immoral, and yet a good portion, and they were all, mostly in the South or, in business with it. What would be their, even in that time, what could be the moral defense that we maybe could look back now if everyone had felt that way? It's like, well, they were, they just didn't understand reality or morality, but in their time, there was that moral debate, and what could have been, I can't even imagine living in that time and accepting any kind of moral argument for the justification of slavery. I mean, what would be a Southern slave owner's justification in the face of someone, of a peer saying how wrong it is?
Well, my colleagues, I'll start. If I leave something out, you tell me. First of all, you are talking about historical myopia. Because as I say to my classes, I say 100 years from now, people may look back at us and say, didn't they see, they kept burning all that fossil fuel with those antique internal combustion engines. They're melting all the caps, everybody but the guy who was president at that time knew that. See where I'm going with that?
Well, but I'm saying there were people, it seemed like the majority of people in the world were, in our time, it's like, well, there are people who are environmentally aware and don't want to do that, but we're all kind of on the same boat with that. Whereas in that time, there was a minority of people really who were justifying slavery.
Well, no.
No?
Let me stop that one right there.
Yeah.
Let me explain that the Southerners had a very good argument, a legal argument. Slavery is sanctioned in the Constitution of the United States and by the laws which follow the writing of the Constitution of the United States. And we're talking about this period exactly, 1840, 41, this period right now. As my colleagues will tell you, that if you look at the institution of slavery and you want to examine the morality of slavery, go back and read Jefferson. There's all kinds of arguments which are made that slavery is a beneficial system for the slave. After all, the black man is not equal to the white man. He's still a human being, but he doesn't have the brain, he doesn't have the spirit, he doesn't have the talent of the white man. So the white man is actually doing him a favor. He feeds him, he clothes him, he houses him, he gives him meaningful work, he helps make him a better Christian individual.
So
All
this
this
would
is
have been
beneficial.
this basic disagreement about fundamental assumptions between the slave justifier and the slave denier.
Yeah, and but,
Because you just say, no, you're wrong about the nature of that human being.
well, remember, we're putting this moral twist on it, and we're saying, okay, today when we look at slavery, and I know this, we think of this first and foremost as this immoral institution that existed for so long, a shameful institution that existed in the United States. But again, we're looking back from a period, a century and a half after its end. And even in the North, and this is what's so hard to translate to classes, I don't know about my colleagues, is to try to explain to people that most Northerners had no sympathy at this point, essentially, for the plight of the black man. Now, they may not have favored slavery, but they didn't favor slavery primarily on economic grounds. Because after all, slave labor competes with free labor. And if I lose you on that, then let me give you the analogy I give to my classes. I ask you today, look at the debate over immigration, undocumented immigrants in this country today. Now, it's not exactly equal, but you see the germ of the same emotion and the same moral argument, where people will say, we've got to stop illegal immigration. Illegal immigrants are taking our jobs. In other words, you're displacing workers who go to Americans. Well, flash back, and what you've got is a situation where free Americans, even in the north of the Ohio River, were saying essentially, this is their institution, they're entitled to it, let them keep it. We don't want blacks living here, we don't want to deal with them here, but we don't have any particular objection to this institution as long as it's held where it has always been held. We don't want it spreading, we don't want it here, right? NIMBY, it's a NIMBY issue.
The other thing I think is also important is to put in the context, which is most whites in society believe that everyone who wasn't of European heritage was inferior. I mean, you know, they're making arguments that the Chinese should not be allowed to come to the United States. And of course, in terms of gender, they're saying in the 1840s that no women, once they marry, have the right to property or guardianship of their own children. So if you're able to say that about your wife, you have no difficulty accepting an institution that does the same thing for someone that you, because of your race, thinks is inordinately inferior. And so that's one of those things about gender and race, is that most of the things that slavery did legally were things that have been consistently done legally to women all along. And that's your mother and your wife. So if you can accept that as moral, you have no difficulty accepting slavery as moral as well. Because God said that's how women should be treated, and God said that's how people of color should be.
Aristotle said it too, so there you go.
He was showing us.
Yeah.
And the other thing, one other quick comment, remember that the unique aspect of slavery in the Americas, virtually unique, there were some Native Americans held, but it was racial slavery. In the ancient world, where slavery essentially was you breathe in, you breathe out, and societies floated on slavery. Certainly Rome floated, Greece floated on slavery. But you had this issue where you couldn't identify a slave, even though they actually outnumbered the citizen. You couldn't identify them because you all basically looked alike, and you pretty much came from the same general cultural background, for the most part. But here you have racial slavery, where your anticipation was, if you're dealing with someone from Africa, you are overwhelmingly dealing with someone who was a slave. I mean, Northup is thrown back into slavery. He's kidnapped, he's a free man. He's thrown back into slavery. You're black, you're easily identifiable. Makes it really easy.
Just to cement my naivete on the subject, I'm staggered by the price that you put on those heads. $1,000 in those days. It seems to me that the economic repercussions of that must have been staggering. Would you comment?
Yeah, thank you. It's stupendous when you think about it. We were talking about today would be tens of thousands of dollars, and this was a cash on the barrelhead situation. So that when you read the ads, which are placed in, let's say, the newspapers of Richmond, where they're going to have essentially, they're looking for slaves. So they say, come to such and such a house, we're buying slaves. It almost sounds like Cal Worthington cars, only it's in print, it's not on the tube. So you read this, and they say, top dollar, we'll pay you top dollar. Well, in these days, and I didn't get a chance to say this, one of the most interesting phrases that comes out of this, and it came out during the Civil War, was a Southerner referred to Virginia, and generally speaking the Chesapeake Bay region, as he called it, the nursery of slavery. And what that tells you is that you have a situation where, as Virginia began to decline, and the economy of Virginia, the agrarian economy, the tobacco economy, and other crops were going to decline, what asset did these individuals have, who were either plantation owners or wealthy farm owners? Their wealth was basically in human flesh. So they would bring these people to the slave seller who would give them cash on the barrelhead here, house those individuals essentially in the slave quarters of the establishment itself for a few days, a week or 2 weeks, whatever. They're their property now. Put them aboard the ship, vertical integration, which they probably own. Put them in the hold, sail them to New Orleans, and then sell them for cash on the barrelhead as well. I'll tell you what's the most shocking story, and you read anecdotal evidence of this, and Northup discusses this, is he is in contact with a beautiful mulatto woman who's, again, a slave, and she's on her way down to New Orleans as well. And this woman was, how shall I put it, this woman obviously knew how beautiful she was, right? And she recognized what she was really worth. And she discusses with Northup the likelihood that she will be sold, essentially, to, at least to call New Orleans a sporting man. Because a sporting man, if you think about New Orleans, you think about guys who had tremendous amounts of money, the wealth that floated in that town, and that she would wind up essentially his concubine, which meant she would live a very comfortable life until obviously he tired of her, or she lost her beauty, or had too many children, or something along those lines. But she was looking forward to a life which was going to be a life of comparative ease. Well, what did you pay for a woman like that? I've read documents which say that a woman could be sold for up to $10,000, a slave woman. Now think about $10,000 in terms of mid-19th century buck. That's a lot of money, So there was a lot of money floating around out there for that purpose. Yeah. So $1,000 for a good field hand. But look, and I hate to say this, but if you think about it, again, the analogy would be, if you think about an agrarian economy, if you buy a farm horse and it costs you a lot of money, you inspected that farm horse, you say, I'm going to get good use out of this horse for the next 15 or 20 years. So you can amortize whatever the cost was over that period, plus whatever the feed on the horse and material that was, keep the horse out, shoe it, whatever you do, much more horse. Well, the same logic applied to the slave. If I buy a healthy slave, I know I'm going to get 20, 25, 30 years worth of work out of that slave, and the possibility that while in my, essentially in my service, that I'm going to have more slaves produced. So even though this got Jimmy the Greek in big trouble several years ago, you remember when he was asked to explain why African Americans excel in certain sports? And he was probably half in the bag when he talked. Does anybody remember that famous CBS? He was CBS commentator. He did all his sports. I like Jimmy the Greek. He was a straight shooter. And he said, African Americans have strong haunches and they have a strong backside because they were bred that way. And everybody got really upset about it. And I thought to myself, well, he wasn't politically correct, but in essence, what he was pointing out was that there was an effort to breed the best for the best, because not only did it mean more work for you, but the potential of sale on an individual like that. You didn't want to try to sell a weak or a sick slave unless you were, again, playing the charlatan and trying to mask that illness in that individual. So you wanted people that were going to get you. So for $1,000, you said, oh, I get 20, 30 years worth of work out of this individual before you have to put him out to pasture. Some masters were very, very good. And they actually provided, I don't know about 2 or 3 years, but if they had a lifetime of service with a slave, certainly somebody who was not a field hand, but somebody who was, who was a house slave or an artisan, they have not actually bought their freedom yet. But they would say, okay, well, I have a responsibility. And there was that sense of quote-unquote Christian responsibility, part of the reason why you could justify the institution. And there were others who said, can't sell them for what you can get, like an old car or a broken down egg.
Because to a large extent, almost any time somebody's willing to buy a slave, because slave ownership was so rare, because it was so capital intensive, that somebody is, so you get sold sort of down the economic ladder. And then of course Frederick Douglass has a famous experience with his grandmother is just put in a hut in the woods to die, with the expectation that if her friends and relatives could sneak food out to her, fine. But I'm sure that master in his own mind probably said, I'm letting her rest and not work anymore.
And the other thing that's interesting about the transport is if you look at the slave coffle, the slave coffle has another advantage, which is essentially you take a large number of people, and as you move them from the upper south to the lower south, and you're on these roads, periodically, someone who could afford to would come out and say, I need a hand, meaning to buy a hand. So they literally would buy a slave off you right there. Well, that's cash in your pocket. Why wouldn't you do that? So you're kind of like, I won't say a vacuum salesman, but you're kind of not going door to door. But people know that the coffle is moving along, and there you are. You're prepared to do that. And of course, escape from that situation was almost impossible. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Of course, Africa back then was less developed, really, like it is today in most parts of Africa. But whites generally did not go in and capture slaves. This was a thing where goods were traded to African kings, like muskets, guns, fancy clothes, and other stuff, in return for captured war prisoners and so on. So some people have the idea that even in the LA Times the other day, there was an editorial that said the British went in and captured slaves, which really did not occur. So it was complicit with the Africans in Africa. West Africa was called the white man's grave because there were so many endemic diseases that forced people to go home to Europe within a year or to die there.
By the time you get to the period we're discussing here, the object is to get, it's not even a numbers game, you want everybody there. And I should add one other thing, which is periodically, they did have problems on these slave ships in this period, but it usually occurred because of an outbreak of disease like smallpox, or possibly tainted water aboard the ship, or food, so you might get typhus or typhoid, or a sanitary issue here, cholera was pretty common. And that would be a disaster. But remember, that's why they had insurance, because most of the policies were written. So that if your slave died as a result of that you were indemnified, you were covered, essentially, in the policy for that particular occurrence.
Yes,
This is quick, just quick. Was the language then speaking English? I mean, I understand they were American slaves, but was that, so that was the common language, or would there have been any other language?
From all indications of the depositions where the whites are talking about the conversation that goes on, every word is in English. So we can't say what the accent was, we can't say what the slang was, but it's very clear that the slaves were dealing in English. Thank you.
Well,